Over my years of preaching at the Bright Road Church of Christ, which I've preached at for about a dozen years now, I've quoted some very unlikely recording artists to illustrate a few of my sermons. Among the recording artists I've quoted have been Led Zeppelin, Tom Petty, Hank Williams Jr., Tim McGraw, Kanye West, Bob Dylan. And today I'm going to quote from yet another great artist, and this artist's name is Weird Al Yankovic. And the name of this song is I'll Sue Ya. And I'm going to quote most of the lyrics from this song, except those that might, for some people, present a problem being said from the pulpit or in a sermon. No problem with me, but some people might have a problem with it, so I have to be careful about those things. But here are most of the lyrics from Weird Al's song, I'll Sue Ya. He sang, I sued Taco Bell 'cause I ate 500,000 chalupas and I got fat. I sued Panasonic. They never said I shouldn't use their microwave to dry off my cat. I sued Earthlink 'cause I called them up and they had the nerve to put me on hold. I sued Starbucks 'cause I spilled a Frappuccino in my lap and brr, it was cold. I sued Toys R Us. You can see this is kind of dated, 'cause I swallowed a Nerf ball and nearly choked to death. I sued Petco 'cause I ate a bag of kitty litter and now I got bad breath. I sued Duracell. They never told me not to shove that AA right up my nose. I sued Home Depot 'cause they sold me a hammer, which they knew I might drop on my toes. I sued Dell Computers because I took a bath with my laptop. Now it doesn't work. I sued Fruit of the Loom because when I wear their tighty-whities on my head, I look like a jerk. I sued Verizon because I got all depressed every time my cell phone is roaming. I sued Colorado because, I think it looks a little bit too much like Wyoming. I sued Neiman Marcus because they put up their Christmas decorations way out of season. I sued Ben Affleck. Do I even need a reason? If I sprain my ankle while I'm robbing your place, if I hurt my knuckles when I punch you in the face, I'm going to sue. Yes, I'm going to sue. Sue, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. I'll sue ya. I'll take all your money. I'll sue ya if you even look at me funny. These clever lyrics reflect and spoof the sue-happy, litigious society in which we live, in which people are constantly suing one another. And if you're talking about the rich people, the richest among us, people like Oprah and Bill Gates, these people have full-time attorneys on retainer just to deal with the many lawsuits that come their way. And a lot of them do. And if you're well known and you have a lot of money, someone will always be looking out to sue you because someone is always looking to turn a buck without having to earn it. And that's why people pretend to slip and fall in retail stores. And that's why people pretend they have whiplash after the slightest bump to the back of their vehicle. And sometimes it doesn't take much more than that, but then a lot of times we know there are a lot of fakers out there. And even helping professionals like those in medicine, their premiums for malpractice insurance is so high that many of us could live for a year or two on what the premiums cost. And that's just part of the overhead that I'd guess causes healthcare to be so expensive. Too many people are looking for someone to sue. And while there are some lawsuits that have merit, there are also a lot of frivolous lawsuits brought on by greed, again, by those who just want to turn a buck. And so by now you probably know where I'm going with this. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, Paul has no tolerance for Christians bringing each other to court. He was adamant that people in the church not be taking each other to court. Now, there may be a time when criminal acts need to be persecuted or when thieves need to be held accountable, but in terms of trivial matters, certainly the church, certainly at least the leadership of the church, has the competence to deal with some of those things without taking them outside of the church. Surely the church leadership can mediate and settle disputes between dissenting parties. Now, just prior to Paul's warning us not to sue one another in 1 Corinthians 6, he had talked about putting unrepentant sinners out of the church in 1 Corinthians 5. So in chapter 5, there are some things that have no place in the church and should be forced outside, like unrepentant fornicators. But in chapter 6, there are some things that should remain inside the church and not be taken outside to other parties, like minor disputes between members. And when I say minor, I'm talking about disputes that are neither misdemeanors nor crimes. Some of the issues you might see on Judge Judy, for example, could easily be settled amicably out of court. Someone drops your cell phone in the swimming pool. Someone dents your fender in the parking lot. Someone doesn't pay up what they owe on time, or they're not making their payments on time. And perhaps a first step to resolution should be taking such matters to church leaders or to other spiritual leaders that both parties respect and see what kind of advice they have to give. As Paul says in 1 Corinthians 6:1, if any one of you has a dispute with another, do you dare to take it before the ungodly for judgment instead of before the saints? To take disputes outside the church before those who aren't believers means we're admitting defeat. We're suggesting that in the church we're not competent enough to handle our own disputes. Instead, we take them before who Paul refers to as the ungodly. Some translations have it as the unrighteous or the unjust, and I think the term unjust is likely the best term based on the Greek and the context. And people may have balked at Paul's claim that the secular courts were unjust. Now, I'm not saying that all secular judges or lawyers are unjust. In fact, some of them are Christians, and they apply their worldview to their work. But aren't judges and lawyers, aren't they the ones who are all about the law? Didn't they go to school for this? Didn't they pass the bar exam? Aren't they all about justice? But on the other hand, we know that no system that is created or sustained by man is going to be completely just, because people are fallible. People are sinners, but God has given us the true standard of justice in His Word. And being quick to sue a brother or sister is like saying that the Word is not adequate for teaching us principles of justice and fairness. Instead, we might think we need to go to secular magistrates in order to get a fair shake, and that is not necessarily the case. So do you always agree with what the courts decide? Do you always agree with what is decided in the United States Supreme Court? Some of their decisions betray a non-Christian, if not anti-Christian, way of viewing the world. No secular court's decisions are always just. The laws are written, enforced, and interpreted by people who, for the most part, are not Christians and have no vested interest in upholding biblical standards. So why would we take our trivial disputes before them instead of before the people in the church who presumably know the Word of God? Before you go to divorce court, for example, maybe you should go to the elders first, and maybe long before divorce seems like a viable option. Just as the church is competent to judge an unrepentant offender, the church is competent to judge trivial matters among members. And when I say trivial, again, I'm talking about things that may not qualify as misdemeanors or crimes. But we are competent to do this because we have the words of life. The church has the ultimate standard of justice in the Bible. But what qualifies us to be competent as judges in these matters? We'll look at verses 2 and 3. Do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if you are to judge the world, are you not competent to judge trivial cases? Do you not know that we will judge angels? How much more the things of this life? Now that should simply blow us away, that we, the saints, are going to judge the world. In the end-time vision of Daniel 7:22, here's how the King James Version and American Standard render it: when the Ancient of Days came and judgment was given to the saints. And the Septuagint translation, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which was popular in the time of Jesus, is very clear that the saints are given the role of judging in the last days. Now, instead of saints, some translations have the term the Lord's people, which amounts to the same thing, but the term saint merely means yet you have been set apart for God's service. And so it doesn't imply that you are superior to anyone else. Some religious groups have kind of ruined the term saints for some people, but it has nothing to do with merit, it has nothing to do with perfection, but with your standing before God by grace. Sainthood is not earned or bestowed by church vote. it is conferred at conversion. And the saints, that's us, we will judge the world. Now, isn't that mind-boggling? I'm not sure how that is going to look, and Paul doesn't elaborate, but it seems that Christians might play a delegated role in God's tribunal. Maybe we'll be like jurors as the people of the world are lined up before the judgment seat of the divine. Or maybe this means that our very lives serve as judgment against the unrepentant, since a comparison proves that people can do better. People can choose to live for God. So whether as a part of God's tribunal or by our very lives, we are rendering judgment upon the world. And if we're competent for that, then we are certainly qualified to judge trivial matters within the church. I believe that most of these matters could be settled in-house. The term translated trivial matters could simply refer to everyday matters, things that aren't as significant, again, as crimes or misdemeanors. And while these things might not seem trivial, they certainly are in comparison to judgment of the world. In addition to the world, we will judge angels, so how much more qualified are we to judge the things of this life? Therefore, Paul says in verse 4, if you have disputes about such matters, do you ask for a ruling from those whose way of life is scorned in the church? In other words, why go to those who aren't Christians to settle disputes among believers? They don't get it. They don't get it. To trust the world's judgment upon the church is to superimpose the world's values upon the church. And many times we might have done that by applying worldly models or worldly vocabulary to the things of the church. Some examples. The world speaks of marketing. The church speaks of evangelism. The world speaks of recovery. The church speaks of repentance. The world speaks of recruiting. The church speaks of converting. The world speaks of education. The church speaks of edification. The world speaks of entertainment. The church speaks of worship. The world speaks of shortcomings. The church speaks of sin. Now, I don't mean to say that I have a problem with every concept in the world column, but we just need to realize how biblical language differs and casts a brighter light on some of these things. The world's judgment is stifled because the first column is all the world has to work with, but the second column shows the deeper goals of the church. Wisdom from the marketplace, education, support groups, and psychology can at times be helpful to the church as supplemental or to illustrate biblical wisdom. But it often makes sense, for example, to have educators teaching Bible classes at church. It makes sense sometimes to have financial people as treasurers. But we cannot allow the world to dictate how the church functions, and that's what happens if our disputes are settled by the ungodly. In verse 5, Paul says, I say this to shame you. Is it possible that there is nobody among you wise enough to judge a dispute between believers? Paul spent much of the first 4 chapters of this book rebuking Corinthians who thought that they were wise by the standards of secular philosophy. They somehow thought that this made them spiritual superiors. And now, after all that boasting about wisdom, Paul asks, is there no one wise enough among all you supposedly wise people to judge in trivial disputes within the church? Verse 6, but instead, one brother takes another to court, and this in front of unbelievers. When the church's dirty laundry is aired before unbelievers, it naturally doesn't help the church's reputation. But if the church can rise above the ways of the world and operate in ways that distinguish us from the world, some will take notice and know that we are truly set apart to higher standards. But if in the church people are fornicating and divorcing and embezzling and fighting among themselves at the same rate as in the world, then people aren't going to see much difference. As far as they're concerned, there is no difference. Over 30 years ago, a woman in Oklahoma sued a Church of Christ for having disfellowshipped her. And there was a lot more to it than that. I mean, the way they did it may not have been the best or the most biblical way to do it. But it was embarrassing. It made all the morning talk shows. I think they were on Donahue, stuff like that. And then years later, over a decade ago, a Tennessee preacher's wife blew her husband away with a shotgun, claiming spousal abuse. And in those situations, whoever was right or wrong, it's still a black eye on the church when things like that get into the news. Not that criminal activity should be tolerated, but working out problems before they come to these extremes could go a long way. What about the recent scandals involving Jerry Falwell Jr. and now his wife? And one might say, well, what does that have to do with us? He's not a part of our group. Well, maybe not. But that's not how the world sees it, because the world paints everyone claiming to be Christian with the same broad brush. As far as they are concerned, there is virtually no difference from Christians in the world unless it be that Christians are hypocrites because they pretend to be better than others. Now, some will always oppose the church, and they'll always be angry toward the church because their real anger is toward God. They are unhappy with his statutes. They don't like his standards, and if they can suggest that no one lives by them, then somehow they believe that somehow justifies their own bad behavior. So the church's haters are going to hate no matter what we do, no matter what we say, but let's not give them a reason. Let's be the most godly and upright people that we can possibly be. Let's settle our disputes within the church and not share our dirty laundry with the world. Now, I'm not saying that crime should be covered up or that embezzlers or sexual predators who come within the church should be let off the hook, but this is a whole other thing. I don't think Paul is talking about criminal activity here, but there are some religious folks who took others to court over theological matters, over which the courts, of course, have no knowledge or jurisdiction. In Acts 18, verses 17, or verses 12 through 17, Acts 18, verses 12 through 17, while Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, some Jews made a united attack upon Paul, and they brought him to court. They charged him with persuading people to worship God in ways that are contrary to the law. Gallio was neither impressed nor interested. He said in Acts 18, 14, and 15, if you Jews were making a complaint about some misdemeanor or serious crime, it would be reasonable for me to listen to you. But since it involves questions about words and names and your own law, settle the matter among yourselves. I will not be a judge of such things. Now after that, the Jews employed mob rule by beating the synagogue ruler who had apparently become a Christian, and they did so right in front of the court. But verse 17 says that Gallio showed no concern whatever. Now he might have justifiably intervened, since the beating was certainly criminal. But one thing he did know is that the world has no jurisdiction over religious matters. In terms of these, he knew that he did not have the jurisdiction. And in our world today, it isn't against the law to skip communion or to fornicate or to gossip. But these are church matters that we are competent to judge among ourselves. Some in Corinth chose to take in-house matters outside the church, and some might have found sympathetic but unqualified magistrates who were ready to judge. Paul says in verses 7 and 8, the very fact that you have lawsuits among you means you have been completely defeated already. Why not rather be wronged? Why not rather be cheated? Instead, you yourselves cheat and do wrong, and you do this to your brothers. According to Paul, it is better to be wronged than to take a brother to court. Now again, I don't think he's speaking about crimes or misdemeanors, but when lesser disputes arise, we have the resources to mediate, to moderate, and to reconcile. Our efforts may not always be successful, since so much is riding upon the response of the parties as to whether they'll submit, but if we can possibly settle matters out of court, that is what Paul instructs. Better to be slighted by a church member than to air our dirty laundry before the world. So we must weigh the importance of each matter and determine which one should be overlooked. You're not going to like everything that everybody does, not even in your family. But just because you dislike something, you've got to decide whether it's worth trying to change or control. Sometimes it's best to just let it go and hand it over to God. Then we move on. And even Jesus suffered for the sake of peace, so that we might have peace with God and with each other. In 1 Peter 2:23, when they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. While reconciliation with brothers and sisters is usually worth pursuing, some trivial matters may not even be worth mentioning. While Jesus suffered at the hands of others, some of us don't even think that we should be inconvenienced by others. But for the sake of keeping the peace, there are times we just need to settle for the short end of the stick. There are times we just need to take it on the chin. It's better than having disputes that escalate to the boiling point so they spill over into the world. Jesus suffered so that we could be at peace with God. But if you don't know that peace today, it is within your power to change that. Not all by yourself, and certainly not by your own power, but by faith in Jesus Christ as you embrace Him as the Lord of your life.